Hello everyone, my name is Yara, and today I'm going to be doing some reviews of some of the books that I have read recently. As always, recent is a very relative term. Some of these are genuinely books that I read months ago, but I haven't recorded in a while, so I want to talk about them. Also, because I haven't recorded in a while, I do want to take this moment to just emphasize what's going on in the world right now, particularly the genocide in Gaza. I really encourage everyone to keep reading, keep staying on top of it. Do not let this just fall into the sidelines. Keep engaging and learning from Palestinian creators and writers, and keep putting pressure on your congresspeople to advocate for a permanent ceasefire. I think it's really easy to become complacent, especially when you feel like you can't do much, but I think the most important thing is to resist that complacency, to keep being engaged with the subject matter, to keep learning. And this is the case for any issue of inequity and injustice. I'm going to be leaving some links in the description for places to learn more, as well as places that you can donate if you have the means. With that being said, let's get into these reviews. Also, please ignore the mic. I'm trying something new to make my sound better. So the first book that I have to talk about is Love from Mecca to Medina by S.K. Ali. This is the sequel to Love from A to Z by the same author that came out a few years ago, I believe in 2018-ish. And that is one of my favorite books, and definitely one of my favorite YA contemporary romances. Love from A to Z was about our characters Adam and Zainab, who serendipitously meet in an airport on their way to Doha, Qatar, and who end up forming a connection and a bond that eventually develops into a romance. And this book takes place a few years after the events of the first book. Zainab is out of college, she is in law school, and Adam is working as an artist. And the two of them are trying to make things work as a long-distance couple, but the distance is starting to put a strain, in particular because both of them have things that are not going quite well in their life. Zainab is struggling in school and has become the center of a scandal with one of her extracurricular organizations, and Adam is struggling right now to make ends meet and find a stable job as an artist. They are both feeling really insecure and down and scared about what the other person might think about them, especially as they are transitioning into a more serious portion of their relationship. For Thanksgiving break, they decide to go on Umrah, an Islamic pilgrimage, hoping that this journey of spirituality and faith will help them see the bigger picture and hopefully help them get closer together again. But the trip ends up adding even more factors that complicate the situation. While I do not think this book was as good as the first book, I still think it was a really enjoyable read. I just think it took a little bit of time for me to really get invested in the story again. I love the characters. I love Adam and Zainab. I think they were the highlights of the story, getting to see both of their personal journeys in the first book and again in this book. I will say right off the bat, if you do not like the miscommunication trope, then you might not like this book because it's probably one of the central conflicts of the story. However, I am a miscommunication trope defender. I think it can be done very well because yes, you could say that, oh, if they just had a conversation about this, oh, if they just told each other these things, then the conflict would resolve instantly. But the story focuses on why these characters can't express these things to each other, what's holding them back, and the personal journeys that they both have to go on to get to a place where they can communicate more effectively. I thought it was very realistic and also a natural extension of the kind of conflicts and personal struggles that we saw with these characters in the first book. Another aspect of the story that I really liked was its discussion of faith. The nature of the story taking place in Umrah and going from Mecca to Medina, like the holiest sites in Islam, there's going to be discussion of faith and its centrality to the characters of the story. But I liked how the author explored how faith is something that can kind of ebb and flow with a person and how it's not always going to be this consistent thing that you feel connected to. One of the struggles that Zainab has in the story is that she doesn't feel like she is utilizing Umrah and appreciating this experience to its full capacity because she is just not in it. She has too much going on in her life mentally that she can't spiritually connect to it, and that makes her feel very self-conscious, especially with the fact that Adam is the opposite, where he feels very connected spiritually. A big part of that for him, and a big inciting factor about why they went on Umrah during this break to begin with, is the fact that Adam has multiple sclerosis, and that he feared that one day he wouldn't have the physical capacity to be able to make this journey in the future, and so he's really trying to capitalize on this moment now. So yeah, I really liked the fact that we got to explore this relationship even further. I feel like that's something that we don't get to see a lot in YA contemporary romance. We kind of always just cut off right after they get together. and see the ways of how these characters learn to adapt with the things that life throws at them and how that affects their relationship. So overall, I gave this book 4 stars. It was really enjoyable and I highly recommend it. The next book that I have is This Is How You Lose the Time War by Emil M. Muhtad and Max Gladstone. I have been meaning to read this book for so long. It was so popular a couple years back, and then it kind of had a resurgence in the public sphere like maybe 1 or 2 years ago with a tweet by someone named Bigless Diggiless, I'm pretty sure. And it was really that tweet that got me into reading this book because I was really in the mood for something that was very beautiful, very vibey. And boy, did this book deliver. This is a science fiction novella about 2 special agents, Red and Blue, who are racing against time, trying to secure the events of history to align with the futures of their respective empires. Red is from a more technology, robot-based future, whereas Blue is from a more biosphere, natural world-centered future. They begin writing letters to each other, first as threats, but then later develop a camaraderie and eventual more romantic relationship through these letters. The entire book is told through these letters, and the letters themselves are very introspective, with these characters talking about their personal histories, what brought them to where they were, how they function within their organizations and their futures, but also philosophical about life and different historical events, and their perspectives about what it means to find meaning in different things in life. Through the nature of their work, they both live various lives. They basically insert themselves into a time and become a part of that point of time. But they are constantly grounded to each other and to a certain timeline through these letters, through an invisible string, if you will. If you know anything about this book, it's probably that the language is flowery, which can be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on your preference. For me, it worked. I loved how lyrical it was, how the prose had such a rhythm in it that you really felt the emotion. It was really able to evoke something in you. It's one of those books that reminds you how beautiful the written word can be in a way that is similar to poetry. However, I will say that the lyricism was almost distracting to a point. Like, I read this book via audiobook the first time, and I was really immersed in the language and what they were saying, but I wasn't really like fully in it and understanding what was going on. I fully finished the whole book and did not understand anything about what was going on in the ending. Like, no plot, just vibes. So I had to reread it and kind of make sure I was putting my full focus into understanding what was going on, because there's a lot of the plot is dependent on very small details that are interspersed within the letters. I don't know if that's necessarily a flaw of the book, more so it's just something that I recommend taking your time with, and it's a short book, so that's not a big ask. And ultimately, I gave this book 4 stars. The next book I read was actually a collection of poems called Look by Solmaz Sharif. This was a book that one of my friends lent to me because I mentioned that I wanted to start getting more into poetry, and she thought I might enjoy this. And while it was definitely out of my comfort zone, I actually ended up really liking it. This collection of poems centers war, specifically the American invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, and it does so by using the vocabulary of the military dictionary, specifically the Department of Defense Dictionary of Military and Associated Terms. And that was a really effective way to illustrate this kind of dichotomy of the kind of sterility and supposed objectivity of military language with the actual effects that it has on people in the countries that America invaded. And it was overall a commentary on the way that institutions can hide behind the technicality of language and control its perception and its effects and kind of remove it from the realm of violence, despite it being an active part in the violence against these kind of communities. I don't have too much else to say about this collection. I am not a scholar on poetry. I don't really know how to properly criticize this. I did enjoy the experience of reading it. It felt like I was back in English class with annotating. I definitely had to look up some commentaries about some of the poems because I feel like the meaning kind of flew over my head initially. So I don't think that it's the best maybe for someone who is brand new to poetry, but if you are already interested in this subject matter, it's a great one to check out. The next book I have is Hena Carries On by Uzma Jalaluddin. This is the second book that I read by this author, the first one being Aisha at Last, which I read a few years ago, and I have a review of it, so I'll link that. This is an adult Muslim romance starring Hena Khan, who is an aspiring radio host who is currently doing an internship at a radio station, but who is not given a lot of freedom on the kinds of topics that she is allowed to discuss, so she decides to start her own podcast where she is able to tell the kinds of stories that she wants to tell. Hena's family are also the owners of the only halal restaurant in her neighborhood in Toronto, which is increasingly struggling due to the rise of gentrification. It only gets worse when a rich corporation decides that they are going to build their own halal restaurant down the street, run by a young guy named Aiden. Now Hena is trying to figure out how to best support her family's business and how to compete with this new guy. And as this is a romance, the more she gets to know Aiden, the more attraction she begins to develop. So similar to this author's first novel, it had a very addictive writing style and pace. I felt like I was immediately engaged and I really wanted to follow this relationship and see where it went. And I think this book did a really good job of balancing both what was going on in Henna's personal life as well as mixing it in with that new relationship that is brewing. One of my favorite things that this book brought up is this discussion about what kinds of stories marginalized peoples are allowed to tell. As I said in the beginning blurb, Hena is an aspiring radio host, and she is really passionate about telling stories about her community, specifically the complexities of community, about family dynamics, about history, about difficult choices and difficult situations that people can be put in. But at her internship, they pretty much only want her to stay within the realm of talking about relatively sterile topics like henna designs, or talking about Islamic radicalization, things that would be more palatable to Western audiences, basically. And this inner conflict that Hena has gets even more exacerbated when she becomes the victim of an anti-Muslim hate crime. And suddenly all these news outlets and reporters want her to speak about this situation, when all she wants is to just kind of move on and allow to be a person outside of this experience. I really loved how central this conflict was in the novel because it's very common for people of marginalized communities to feel like they are only allowed to be pigeonholed into one identity that is representative of their entire community. And a lot of times, that identity is centered around their trauma. They're not allowed to be nuanced, they're not allowed to be complex. And it really hammers down this idea that the general public only values certain narratives from certain communities. With that being said, and while I really appreciate that discussion that the author brought, I do think that certain narrative decisions that she decided to do in the third act kind of diminished the impact of this theme that she was setting up. And it's actually a problem that I think she also had in Aisha at Last, where she decides to add stakes to the third act that I don't think were necessary to drive the point home and actually took me out of the story. This is going to be a little bit spoilery, so if you don't want to hear, then you can skip to the end, wherever I say the timestamp is. But basically, I don't think that the hate crime plotline needed to be expanded and take up as much space in the story as it did, to the point where the protesters were coming to the food festival at the end of the book. And the only reason I say this is not because it's not a realistic thing that could happen and has happened to communities, but it's that the entire book is centered on this idea that you don't want your story to be taken up by these trauma narratives, that you want to allow people of our communities to just be human, to have lives outside of Islamophobia. And so I think to ultimately center your story on Islamophobia almost kind of defeats the purpose. I don't know, I'd love to hear other people's thoughts about this if they read it, but that was the impression I got after finishing the book. Overall, I gave this book 3.5 stars, mainly because I just had a good time while reading it. I really did enjoy the romance, maybe because it's like the inherent rivals to lovers nature of it. And like I said, I did like a lot of the ideas that the story brought up, even though I do think some of the execution fell a little flat. The next book I have is actually a trilogy, and that is The Summer I Turned Pretty trilogy. So I actually watched the series before I read the books. It was just something that I saw being advertised, and it was the exact vibe that I was looking for. This summer romance, teen YA romance angst. Love that. But after I finished season 2, I was like, I need to know what happens. I need to know who she ends up with, even though I was spoiled. But I want to know how she ends up with whoever she ends up with. So I decided to read the series. And dare I say, the show is actually better in this case. And that is no shade to Jenny Han, because she's the showrunner of the show. But I think this medium works better in TV, and also they made some changes that I think work better in the show than they did in the book. But also vice versa. There are some things in the book that I don't know why they changed in the show, but let's just get into it. So you probably already have heard of this series. It was very popular in the early 2010s, and then it is very popular right now because of the Amazon Prime show. So this is about a girl named Belly who spends every summer at her mom's best friend's beach house. And her mom's best friend has 2 sons named Jeremiah and Conrad. Side note, that is the most preppy New England rich boy names I have ever heard. Which makes sense, because that is who they are. Belly has had a crush on Conrad for her entire life, but she's always felt like he's only seen her as like a little sister and not really taken her seriously. But this is the summer that she turned pretty, where she feels like she's finally growing into herself, into her femininity, and feeling like they are actually going to see her as a girl. This is not supposed to be a review of the show, but these stories are so intertwined, and because Jenny Han is a showrunner of the show, that I can't separate my experience of the book from my experience from the show, since basically the entire time when I read the book was just comparing it to how it is in the show. And I think my rating of the books would have been even lower if I hadn't read the show, because I was already attached to the characters. I already had a vision of how they acted and their personalities based off of the show that I can kind of interpolate onto the book series, perhaps in places where the book doesn't give them as much nuance. In the case of Conrad, for example. What I really found interesting about first diving into these books was just how much of the story was contained in Belly's head, and this is kind of a pattern that I see with a lot of romance books, though I haven't read too many. But they're very insular, like they're very much consumed in the protagonist's perspective. And in the case of Belly, so much of her narrative is centered on wanting to be included, of wanting to be taken seriously because she is the youngest in this group of kids. There's such a yearning to be older, and it's really evident in the way that Belly talks about Susanna, her mom's best friend, who is basically the embodiment of womanhood to Belly. And in this yearning to no longer be seen as a kid, Belly's voice comes off as very immature, which is very much understandable. She's like 15 at the start of the story. But it's really interesting to see that given what her trajectory in the show is going to be. In the second and third book, we start to get Conrad and Jeremiah's perspective, so the story isn't as insular. And I feel like this was really necessary because in the first book, I felt like we didn't have a good understanding of any character besides Belly, especially Conrad, and Jeremiah a little bit, but we saw a little bit more of him. Whereas Conrad was kind of relegated to this like broody, dark character who didn't really speak that much. But because we get their perspective in the next two books, we get to actually understand what's going on with them, their struggles, their insecurities. So what was a very interesting experience for me is that in the show, I'm 100% Team Conrad. I do not like Jeremiah, and I actually love Conrad. I think the show gave him a lot more nuance, especially with having him struggle with panic attacks. And also just the way that Chris Briney plays him, a lot of the lines in the book that may read as more callous are not as callous in the TV show. And then you also see his facial expressions in other situations that make you better believe that he genuinely does care about Belly and about all the other characters in the show. And the opposite was true for Jeremiah, where I don't like Jeremiah in the show. I think he's selfish, a bit self-absorbed, and just not very kind and understanding of either Belly or Conrad. But in the book, he's so much better. He's way more understanding, shows a much higher level of maturity in his perceptions of the other characters, gives a lot more grace to other characters, where perhaps if I hadn't seen the show already, I would be Team Jeremiah in the books. Another thing that I kind of took away from this series is that if Jenny Han had took the series in a slightly different direction, this would have been like the YA version of Little Fires Everywhere, just about this seemingly perfect family breaking down because of their striving for perfection. Even though I don't really like Jeremiah, I do empathize a lot with his struggles about being the brother of the golden child, of always being compared to his brother, and his difficult relationship with his dad. And with Conrad, having the difficulty to uphold a standard for other people that perhaps you don't want to, and not being allowed to fully express yourself or talk about things for fear of breaking the image of their family that his mother wanted, especially with the fact that their mom is so idolized among almost everyone in the show. But in a lot of ways, she is very flawed in how she operated in this family. I just think that would have been a really interesting way to take this story, and I think the show actually does delve into this conflict a lot more by introducing like Susanna's half-sister. But again, this series is definitely still cemented as a YA romance, so they're not going to go too far into those aspects, but I appreciate that we get glimpses of them. In terms of rating, I gave the first book, The Summer I Turned Pretty, 2.5 stars. I gave the second book, It's Not Summer Without You, 3 stars, and I give the last book, Will Always Have Summer, 3.5 stars. The last book is definitely the best one. The first two were a bit of a struggle, and like I said, if I hadn't already had a connection to these characters and liked the series, I probably would have rated it a little lower. So the next book that I'm going to talk about is More to the Story by Hena. This is a book that I read for the middle grade magic readathon, which I think is the last video that I posted was the announcement for that. Again, recent reads is very relative. But anyways, this is a middle grade retelling of Little Women, starring a girl named Jamila who works as a featured editor for her middle school's newspaper. The problem is that the editor-in-chief keeps shutting down her ideas. I didn't realize this is a similar plot device to Hena Carries On, but just a middle grade version. She's assigned to interview the new boy in school named Ali, who just moved from the UK. But she's struggling to figure out what angle to take with this story. At the same time, Jamila and her sisters are struggling with the news that their father is going to be moving overseas to take on a new job, and so she's even more determined to make sure that this piece of writing is something that is meaningful and something that her father can be proud of. This story was so lovely. Just as a disclaimer, I have not read the original Little Women. I've only seen the Greta Gerwig version, which I loved. But I think it definitely adheres to the heart of it being a story about sisterhood. However, other than that, I don't think that you should go into it expecting a very close adaptation or retelling of Little Women. As you can tell from the description, this kind of skeleton of the plot is similar, but a lot of the character dynamics are a little bit changed, which is fine. It's an adaptation. It's not supposed to be one-to-one. The story actually felt very similar in vibe and thematically to Diary of a Future President, which used to be a show on Disney+, but they've removed it from the platform for some reason. But in the sense that it follows this middle school girl who is so ambitious and so driven and just want to take on the world, but also in that pursuit not realizing that their personal goals and ambitions may interfere with their interpersonal relationships, and how in trying to write a good story, you can end up betraying someone's trust and really overstepping their boundaries. On a personal level, I really love the story because it centered this Muslim Pakistani family. I'm not Pakistani, but I am Muslim. And I love how it's just a very mundane story because, kind of like I was talking about with Hena Carries On, a lot of the stories about marginalized communities end up being centered on their trauma. And so I love the fact that young Muslim kids get to have this kind of a story. There were so many cute scenes regarding the family dynamic, especially with the sisters. There's one in particular where I think we find out that Jamila's older sister gets asked to the prom by someone, or like to homecoming. And the way the scene plays out and everyone's reactions to it, I don't know, maybe not everyone find it necessarily funny, but the situation was just so realistic and how that kind of situation would go down that I just found it so amusing. And then there were other conversations where I'm like, yeah, that's exactly a conversation that I've had with someone in middle school. And so it was really fun to read in that regard. One thing I'll say is that I think the story played it a little safe in terms of it adapting the story of Little Women. I won't go into a lot of details, but if you know the story of Little Women, you know that there is a kind of sadder emotional aspect to that story, and more to the story definitely touches on it, but I think it doesn't explore it to the depth that Little Women does, which is a little bit strange to me because I believe Little Women is also considered a children's novel or like a family novel, but I could be wrong about that. But on the other hand, I do understand why the author may not have wanted to fully delve into that. It just might not have tonally fit, but I feel like there is a universe where it could have been delved into a little bit more. If you're looking for a short, sweet, and just very wholesome middle grade novel to read, I highly recommend this one. I ended up giving it 4 stars. I gave a lot of books 4 stars this round, I realized. So those are all the books that I'm going to talk about today. I have a lot more that I need to cover, but because there's so many, I'm just going to split these videos up. If you've read any of these books, please let me know what you thought about them. Also, let me know what you're currently reading. I feel like I've been so out of it and not really on top of new releases or just anything that's like hyped up right now in like the book talk or booktube world. So I'd love to know what you're currently reading. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you later. Bye.